Hello, my name is Caroline Barratt. I work as a lecturer in the School of Health and Social Care at the University of Essex. And I'm going to be talking to you today about contemplative education in higher education, with a particular focus on contemplative pedagogy and what that means. I'm going to start today by giving you some personal reflections about how I got involved with contemplative pedagogy, how it became relevant to my work in higher education. And then I'll move on to explore what we actually mean by contemplative pedagogy and how it fits within the broader field of contemplative education. And I'll finish by summarising some of the key learning points from this short talk today, and also provide some learning resources that you might be interested in following up with afterwards. So back in 2014, I was developing a module on the use of mindfulness to help students become more compassionate carers. I was working on this with a clinical psychology colleague, and as part of that exploration, I found out about contemplative pedagogy, and in particular, the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education. And I went along to one of their summer schools and came across ideas about the incorporation of mindfulness and meditation in higher education that I'd never come across before, and I was really excited by what I learned. I've had a contemplative practice, a meditation practice for many years, and never thought it would be relevant to my work in higher education, so this was really exciting for me. So on returning from the summer school, I set up the Contemplative Pedagogy Network because I wanted to connect with other educators working with similar ideas in the UK. And since then, that network has gone from strength to strength, and there has been broadening interest in the field of contemplative education, which I'm really pleased to see. And for those of you wanting to know about those initial sparks of inspiration for me, I've included a few book titles on the slide if you wish to follow those up, particularly the work of Parker Palmer and Arthur Zions. So having told you a bit about my path into contemplative pedagogy, I now want to talk a little bit about what it actually is and how it fits within the broader field of contemplative education. So on this next slide, you'll see listed the core components of contemplative education, as listed on the Mind and Life website for the community of contemplative education. And what's important to realise is that all of these core components interweave with each other. They all overlap in different ways, but you can see contemplative pedagogy listed here. And contemplative pedagogy might refer to the inclusion of things like mindfulness, meditation, compassion practices in teaching settings in higher education. And another way that we can look at this is through the model put forward by Ergas and Hadar in their 2019 paper, where they describe mindfulness in education and mindfulness as education, and these being two complementary strands of the manifestation of mindfulness in education. So mindfulness in education, they're used to refer to mindfulness interventions that are delivered often by external teachers that are aimed very much at supporting the well-being and improving the academic performance of students, and they're often presented as standalone interventions. They contrast this with mindfulness as education, so the inclusion of mindfulness practice in the delivery of curriculum content, mindfulness practice that is woven into the students' learning. And this is much more a process-focused way of including mindfulness. We're not so focused on the outcomes, but we're focused on mindfulness as a way of learning. They're usually delivered by the teachers themselves, the teachers that are delivering the content to the students, and so are therefore more integrated. And mindfulness in as education is really where contemplative pedagogy sits. It's not something that we do to improve the well-being or performance of students, although that might be a side effect of it, and a welcome one at that. But it's very much a way of teaching and learning that uses contemplative practice in the delivery of content and in the development of the understanding and knowledge of students. So I hope that that's put contemplative pedagogy helpfully within the wider spectrum of contemplative education more broadly. And now I'm going to move on to exactly what we mean by contemplative pedagogy. So what is contemplative pedagogy? So it's been defined in different ways, and I think it's a new term that we're actually just starting to work out what it actually means. But Erges and Hadar usefully define contemplative pedagogy as the incorporation of mindfulness towards teaching subject matter in engaging, experiential and inquiry-based ways. And I think this is a very, very helpful place to start. In my definition on the Contemplative Pedagogy Network blog, I really focus on the importance of contemplative pedagogy as a way of bringing first-person experience into teaching and learning. So these are approaches that really ask students to develop awareness of and incorporate their subjective and internal experience into what they're learning. So they really connect the knowledge and understanding that they're developing to their own sense of values and to their own experience in the world. Arthur Zions usefully refers to contemplative practices as facilitating awareness of the inner world as well as the external world. Overall, I consider contemplative pedagogy to offer a rebalancing of the focus of education. Traditional Western pedagogies have tended to focus very much on teaching and learning about the external world in objective and rational ways, and haven't really allowed space for inner knowing, for the subjective and for the emotional aspects of our experience. And to me, this is a real weakness in that educational approach, because our internal and subjective understanding of the world plays such a huge role in how we think, in how we speak, and how we act in the world. And so in a sense, this is quite a dangerous oversight that has a high price for individuals and potentially for society as well. So moving on to this next slide, I've just tried to draw out what I think are the key threads of contemplative pedagogy as it's developing in higher education at the moment. And I'm really pleased to say that it's actually being developed in a huge diversity of fields, different subject areas, and I think that this is a really important aspect. The diversity of this movement is a real strength. But I've picked out 4 threads that I've seen through my own practice as well as my work with the network that I think are particularly important to highlight here. So I'll start by mentioning professional training, because this is very much important to me within the School of Health and Social Care. We train health and social care professionals, so this is very close to the work that I do on a daily basis. I've developed a module called Mindfulness, Compassion and Compassionate Care. And in this module, I use mindfulness practice as a way of helping the students connect with their own inner experience. We also use a range of meditative reflections to really try and provide space for people to reflect meaningfully on the connection between the course content, their own experience and their own values, and how that might manifest in their own practice. And I know that in the network, probably the highest proportion of members that we have are training people in medical, healthcare or social work arenas. So I know that this is a very vibrant area of development. And in one department, I'm aware that there's now a contemplative pedagogy lead. So really reflecting the movement of different departments towards including these ways of teaching and learning, particularly in regards to professional development. So the next area I want to talk about is contemplative inquiry and subjective experience. And really here what we're pointing to is the use of contemplative practices that help connect students to their lived experience of learning, helping them to become more aware of their own mind, their own bodies, how they respond to what they're learning, and what the ramifications of that are for their changing mind as they learn, as they develop through the duration of their courses. These practices might also include explicit exploration of mind, of thought, of what it means to be a thinking, feeling human being. When I was at the summer school, Daniel Barratt talked about an exercise that he did with his economics students where he asked them to reflect on every purchase they made over the space of a week, to reflect on the mental states that arose prior and after that purchase, the embodied feelings, the emotions that arose in response to buying things that they wanted. And I felt that this was a beautiful illustration of how contemplative inquiry can really help to deepen learning, increase our awareness, and to understand how our thoughts and feelings affect how we then interact with the external world around us. And so thirdly, moving on, I wanted to talk about social justice and the use of contemplative practice to support initiatives and students' awareness around social justice and the pursuit of equality. A particularly strong example of this, I think, is around anti-racism work and the work of Rhonda McGee, for example, where they are encouraging students to engage in contemplative practice, to develop an internal awareness so that they become conscious of their emotional and subjective experience, that they can use mindfulness practice to ground themselves, to cope with the strong emotional feelings that can arise from these explorations, and of course to hold with compassion the views of others, which we inevitably come up against in those challenging domains when we explore them. And also this links to the work, I think, of social mindfulness, which is very much developing in response to critique of mainstream mindfulness models that have been criticised for being quite individualistic and reinforcing those tendencies. So we have a lovely interplay here between the work of contemplative educators and those working in the social mindfulness field too. So there's lots of important cross-links and areas for exploration, I think, going forward. So the last strand that I'd like to draw out around contemplative pedagogy and how it's developing is to particularly emphasise the importance of contemplative practice for educators. Through my work with the network in particular, and through the 3 symposiums that we've run over the last 3 years, I've seen how educators value having some space to engage in meditation, to engage in creative practices that connect them to their sense of values, to connect them to the meaning and the purpose of the work that they do. I think this is important particularly at the moment when there are questions about the value and the purpose of higher education, particularly in Western settings, when educators are often working in really high stress situations. And of course this is true for teachers too, true for educators through the whole education system. If we can find practices which ground us, which enable us to become stiller, it can help to support our well-being, it can help to ground us, to help us to become embodied and engaged teachers. But it can also help us to become connected to a sense of inspiration, a wider sense of why it is that we do what we do. And I think this is really, really sustaining. And I think that this appreciation and incorporation of our inner worlds as educators no doubt has a very positive effect on our students. Because we're more engaged, we can be more present in our teaching, more present when we're trying to convey teaching and knowledge and content to our students. I think it has a very, very positive effect. And I've really noticed this in my own practice, my ability to really be present with where my students are at, my ability to not take things quite so personally, painfully personally, when teaching doesn't quite go as I expect. And this has turned me into a much more experimental and hopefully exciting educator, because I'm not so worried about taking risks. I'm not so worried about falling flat on my face in the classroom, because I've got something more to sustain me, and I have a sense of the purpose which really underlies all it is that I do. So I think this is a really important thread that we can draw out in the latest developments around contemplative pedagogy. So just to finish, I've just summarised some of the key learning points that I really hope that you'll take away from today's session. So firstly, that contemplative pedagogy really refers to ways of bringing first-person perspectives into teaching and learning. So really bringing the students' experience into their own awareness and into the classroom or the lecture hall. That contemplative pedagogy can be used to deepen understanding of curriculum content and can be integrated into different subject areas in different ways. So there's a lot of flexibility around how this can be applied. It's also important, really important, we haven't had much time to talk about it today, to consider the safety and acceptability of contemplative practice in all education settings, but I think in higher education setting, with the diversity of students that we're teaching, the diversity of settings that we're teaching in, this is really key. We also want to emphasise the importance of contemplative pedagogy as a holistic and rewarding approach for educators, for us to really reconnect with why we do what we do. And lastly, the profound value of community and connection as a way of developing our own practice and for working out how this should develop and how this should manifest across education. I have included some learning resources on the last slide for further reading if you're interested. Thank you very much.